Welcome, everybody. I note that a quorum is present. The committee is meeting today for a hearing on a major test for higher education, how Congress can help students and institutions cope with COVID-19. As this is a completely virtual hearing, I'd ask that all microphones for members and witnesses participating remotely be kept muted as a general rule to avoid unnecessary background noise. Members and witnesses will be responsible for unmuting themselves when they are recognized to speak or when they wish to seek recognition. And further, per House Resolution 965 and its accompanying regulations, members are required to leave their camera on the entire time they are in an official proceeding, even if they step away from the camera. While a roll call is not necessary to establish a quorum in official proceedings conducted remotely, whenever there is an official proceeding with remote participation, the clerk will call the roll to help make clear who is present at the start of the proceeding. At this time, I ask the clerk to call the roll.
Chairwoman Davis.
Present.
Mr. Courtney.
Present.
Mr. Takano. Ms. Jayapal. Mr. Harder.
Present.
Mr. Levin.
Present.
Ms. Omar. Mr. Trone. Mrs. Lee. Mrs. Trahan. Mr. Castro. Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Sablon.
Present.
Ms. Bonamici.
Present.
Ms. Adams. Mr. Norcross.
Present.
Chairman Scott. Mr. Smucker.
Here.
Mr. Guthrie.
Here.
Mr. Grothman.
I'm here.
Ms. Stefanik. Here. Mr. Banks. Okay. Mr. Banks. Mr. Walker. Mr. Comer. Klein.
Here.
Mr. Fulcher.
Sir.
Mr. Watkins. Mr. Muser. Mr. Murphy.
Here.
Mrs. Fox.
Here.
Chairwoman Davis, this concludes the roll call.
Thank you very much. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, opening statements are limited to the chair and the ranking member. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and provides all members with adequate time to ask questions. I recognize myself now for the purpose of making an opening statement. Today, as we know, we are examining how the COVID-19 pandemic is straining our higher education system and discussing what Congress must do to support students and institutions through this difficult time. Across the country, the rush to suspend on-campus activities and switch to online learning has exacerbated pre-existing systemic inequities in higher education.
Systemic.
For example, the on-campus resources that many students from low SES backgrounds normally rely on, like computer labs and reliable internet, are now unavailable to those students. The suspension of on-campus activities is also threatening many students' access to basic essentials like food and housing. And for these students, going to school had been their primary way of meeting these needs. The survey from earlier this year found students of color are disproportionately suffering high rates of food and housing insecurity due to the closure of campuses. Research also indicates how most students do not perform as well in online classes. Now imagine how students who are already started off with fewer resources are more likely to struggle and
This is
face
Robert
greater
Scott, and my name is Robert Scott.
under these new educational conditions.
Thank
To
you.
address these disparities, Congress secured $14 billion in emergency relief funding for higher education in the Bipartisan Cares Act. And half of this funding was allocated specifically for direct student emergency aid. Additionally, Congress provided immediate relief to student loan borrowers by suspending student loan payments and freezing interest on all direct and federally held student loans. Unfortunately, instead of quickly dispersing these urgent relief funds to students, however, according to the law that we had passed in March, Secretary DeVos created an arbitrary eligibility requirements for students trying to access this support. These restrictions not only prevent relief funding from quickly reaching students, but they exclude several underserved groups of students who cannot apply for Title IV aid, such as undocumented students and veterans. In response, the state of Washington and the California Community College System, which includes the San Diego Community College District, sued Secretary DeVos. Thankfully, these lawsuits have temporarily stopped the department from denying California community college students and students across Washington access to the emergency student aid that Congress secured. But setting aside the delays and the unnecessary restrictions created by the department, we must also address how the CARES Act simply did not go far enough to prepare our institutions for this looming economic recession. Due to the pandemic, institutions are facing unprecedented state and local budget shortfalls that will trigger drastic funding cuts for higher education. And they are facing massive revenue losses due to decreased enrollment and suspended activities. On top of all of these cuts in revenue losses and programs that many vulnerable students need to complete their degree and fulfill the risk of exposing students, educators, and communities to COVID-19. The evidence is overwhelmingly clear. Congress must do more to support our students and our institutions. The HEROES Act would take a critical step in the right direction. It provides nearly $1 trillion to help state and local governments avert massive budget shortfalls and cuts to education. It also provides over $35 billion in direct relief funds for public institutions and other institutions that have suffered financially, including almost $2 billion for HBCUs, TCUs, and MSIs. Beyond extra funds, however, Congress must also protect students from predatory for-profit schools. These institutions have a record of using taxpayer dollars to target vulnerable students during economic downturns, often leaving them with worthless degrees and debt that they cannot repay. Simply put, the COVID-19 pandemic is testing not only our students and our institutions, but Congress's commitment to ensuring all students have access to safe, affordable, and quality education. Today, with the help of our witnesses, and we appreciate their being here, we will discuss whether we can live up to that commitment. I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Schmucker, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Davis. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
Before I discuss the topic of today's hearing, I'd just like to mention the importance of doing our work in person. I and several other members.
Mr. Smuck, yeah, you're.
Should I try it without the microphone? Let me switch. Still coming through poorly.
Yeah.
It was working a little bit ago. Give me just a second. I'm gonna.
Ranking Member Smucker?
Yes.
Yes, sir. When we did your initial audio visual check, were you using the AirPods at the time, sir?
I was not.
You sound fine now, sir.
Is that better? Okay, I'll
It
take
is
this
better,
out.
sir. Yes, I think it is the bouncing back of the microphones. Thank you, sir.
Okay, got it. All right. Sorry about that, Chairwoman. Does that sound better now? Are we good to go?
Yes.
All right. So again, before I discuss the topic of today's hearing, I just did want to talk about the importance of doing our work in person. I and several other members are here in the hearing room. Leader McCarthy had recently written in a letter to Speaker Pelosi that our Congress, which is literally a coming together of people and ideas, it works best when it happens in person, face to face. And while I know that we've all learned how to Zoom and WebEx and all of this, I really do think that we could be operating here in person. And so I will make the same request that Ranking Member Fox made at the start of our last hearing, which is let's return to congressional precedent and hold our hearings here in person. Turning to the topic of today's hearing, COVID-19 certainly has disrupted nearly every aspect of American society, including our higher education. And it was back in early March, University of Washington became the first school to cancel in-person classes. Today, over 1,000 colleges and universities have switched to online-only instruction. From abrupt school closures to remote online learning, students and educators have faced overwhelming challenges during this pandemic. And that's why Congress and the Department of Education took several steps to ease the burden for states, for institutions, and for students. The Bipartisan Cares Act, which was passed in March, included provisions to help students, schools, and state governments cope with the changes wrought by the pandemic. In addition to regulatory relief measures for students and institutions, the CARES Act provided borrowers with temporary respite from their repayment obligations. Specifically, the legislation requires the Secretary to suspend all interest accumulation and monthly payments on federally held student loans through September 30th of this year. Most critically, the CARES Act created and funded the Higher Ed Emergency Relief Fund, which provided billions in direct aid to students and post-secondary education institutions, including the HBCUs and MSIs. But of course, that's not to say our work is done. On the contrary, the pandemic has exposed serious underlying deficiencies in our education system. Government overreach and unnecessary intervention has contributed to a bloated post-secondary education sector at the expense of students. Tuition and fees have far outpaced inflation for decades. Federal requirements stifle interaction between businesses and college campuses. And unfortunately, rather than innovating, the Democrats' Partisan Heroes Act really doubles down on what have been failed policies. This legislation forgives $10,000 of federal and private student loan debt for some borrowers, which really does nothing to combat COVID-19 or lower college costs. I really do recognize that we want to help people struggling to make ends meet, but we have data from the Urban Institute to prove that across-the-board loan forgiveness disproportionately helps high-earning, highly educated individuals. Many Americans facing the greatest financial strain as a result of the pandemic do not have student loans at all. The bill also launches a socialist takeover of the private student loan market by forcing private student loan companies to offer income-driven repayment terms and conditions that are dictated by the federal government. In contrast, committee Republicans continue to support reforms that strengthen innovation and completion, modernize federal student aid, and promote student opportunities. By giving students the tools, needed to complete an affordable post-secondary education, we can prepare them to enter the workforce with the skills they need for lifelong success, regardless of their background. However, these reforms won't matter if we don't reopen our nation's schools and businesses safely and responsibly. We have a duty to lead this country back to the pre-pandemic economic prosperity that benefited millions of hardworking Americans. Congress can help further unleash our nation's economic potential by increasing pathways for Americans to succeed in the 21st century workforce. Specifically, this means permitting colleges and universities to leverage employer expertise, encouraging short-term and stackable credentials, and creating a regulatory framework for new methods of learning like competency-based education. These types of forward-looking reforms have been championed by the Trump administration. Just a few weeks ago, President Trump issued an executive order to prioritize skills-based hiring within the federal government to help strengthen and diversify our workforce. This action will take our nation's workers and students in a positive direction as we recover from COVID-19, and Congress should follow the administration's lead on this issue. Look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how we can improve our education system to better meet the needs of students, families, and workers. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Ranking Member Smucker. All other members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 on Monday, July 21st. It's now my pleasure to introduce our witnesses. First is Dr. Sharon Pierce, PhD, President of Minneapolis Community and Technical College. Since 2016, Dr. Sharon Pierce has been leading the effort at Minneapolis College to provide transformative student experiences. Dr. Pierce has dedicated her career to advancing the role of community and technical colleges in reducing disparities and providing underrepresented students with an opportunity to achieve academic success. Prior to her higher education career, Dr. Pierce worked as a clinical nurse for 12 years and was appointed by Maryland's governor to serve on the state's Board of Nursing. She earned her bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Maryland and her doctorate degree in urban education from Morgan State University. Our next witness is Dr. Timothy White, PhD, Chancellor of California State University. Since 2013, Dr. White has been leading the California State University, the CSU system, a system comprised of 23 campuses and 481,000 students and 53,000 faculty and staff. Dr. White is a champion of inclusive excellence and student success, and a proponent of bringing individualized education to scale through the expansion of proven best practices. Prior to becoming CSU Chancellor, Dr. White served as Chancellor and Professor of Biology and Biomedical Sciences at the University of California, Riverside for 5 years, and as President of the University of Idaho for 4 years. Dr. White pursued his higher education from Diablo Valley Community College, Fresno State, CSU East Bay, and the University of California, Berkeley. Next is Scott Pulsifer. I hope I have that right, sir. President of Western Governors University. Since 2016, Scott Pulsifer has served as president of Western Governors University, the nation's first and largest competency-based university. Under his leadership at WGU, WGU has expanded access to online competency-based degree programs that serve students across the country. Prior to joining WGU, Pulsifer gained extensive leadership and experience in technology-based, customer-focused businesses, including Amazon, Sterling Commerce, which is now part of IBM, and 2 successful startups. Pulsifer holds a bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University and a master's degree from Harvard University. And last is Dr. Sharon Harper, recognizing her as a PhD as well, president of the American Educational Research Association and a provost professor in the Rossier School of Education and Marshall School of Business at the University of Southern California at USC. Dr. Harper is also the Clifford and Betty Allen Chair. In Urban Leadership. founder and executive director of the USC Race and Equity Center, and a past president of the Association for the Study of Higher Education. For 2 decades, Harper has studied racial and gender equity in K-12 schools, colleges and university, and corporate contexts. He has been recognized in Education Week as one of the 10 most influential education professors in the United States. Dr. Harper earned his bachelor's degree from Albany State University and a master's and doctor's degree from Indiana University. We greatly appreciate the witnesses for participating today and look forward to your testimony. I wanted to just remind you that we have read your written statements and that they will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D and committee practice, each of you is asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. I also wanted to remind the witnesses that pursuant to Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 1001, it is illegal to knowingly and willfully falsify any statement, representation, writing, document, or material fact presented to Congress, or otherwise conceal or cover up a material fact. During your testimony, staff will be keeping track of time and will use a chime to signal when 1 minute is left and when time is up entirely. They will sound a short chime when there is 1 minute left, and a longer chime when time is up. Please be attentive to the time and wrap up when your time is over and remute your system. If any of you experience any technical difficulties during your testimony or later in the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform. Make sure you are muted with the mute button highlighted in red, and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director, Sheila Havener, whose number has been provided. We will let all the witnesses make their presentations before we move to member questions, and when answering a question, please remember to unmute your system. It's now my pleasure to first recognize Dr. Pierce for 5 minutes. Dr. Pierce.
Thank you. Chairwoman Davis, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished subcommittee members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Sharon Pierce, president of Minneapolis College. My testimony will describe the impact of the global pandemic on community and technical colleges and our students, and the need for Congress to provide additional aid. Our college, located in an urban setting, is the only comprehensive community and technical college in Minneapolis. We serve students who are unlikely to succeed elsewhere, provide an opportunity to complete a credential, and elevate their socioeconomic status and ability to contribute to the economy. Our students face multiple barriers to academic success. COVID-19 put many students out of work, leaving them unable to support families or access transportation or social services, and elevated mental health concerns. Now they must learn to navigate courses through an online platform, often using a smartphone without reliable internet access, creating difficulty connecting to instructors, classmates, tutors, the library, and support services. Our college received $2.3 million in CARES funding for direct student aid. The guidance for this funding was difficult to unravel, and distribution plans needed frequent revising, resulting in more than 2 weeks delay in disbursement. Ongoing eligibility rulemaking by the Department of Education created uncertainty and limited our ability to direct aid to the most at-risk students. In response to COVID-19, we transitioned over 900 classes to alternative remote delivery. Moving forward, technology investments need to be at the forefront of decision-making. Students need hardware, software, network access, training, and more. Faculty, especially in career and technical programs, need training to advance their pedagogy using alternative delivery in synchronous and asynchronous formats. Equitable access to education can only be achieved by ensuring students have the technology tools they need to assist in their academics and receive support services, whether they are on campus or working remotely. To provide a safer campus, we need to invest in facilities upgrades, including contactless hardware, additional cleaning supplies, personal protective equipment, and to engineer facilities to allow for physical distancing. We will continue to reallocate and reduce expenditures as part of our effort to survive potentially significant revenue losses. Moving forward, students who already face significant barriers must navigate a new economic reality. Additional funding from the federal government providing direct aid to students impacted by COVID-19 will support their continuous enrollment and aid the economic recovery of our nation. In addition, the importance of ongoing federal stabilization funds for operating costs of institutions like ours during this trying time cannot be overstated. While the CARES Act provided badly needed stabilization funding, more assistance is vital for us to continue to effectively serve our students, provide remote learning, and prepare to safely reopen our campus. According to recent estimates, community colleges could face a collective revenue reduction of $10 billion over the next year. We want to stress the importance of using student head count-based formula to allocate future federal stabilization funding to institutions of higher education. This will allow us to account for the needs of all of our students, including those who attend part-time. Thank you for replacing the CARES Act formula with a head-based formula in the recently passed HEROES Act. We appreciate your recognition that part-time students need access to the same resources as their full-time peers. We are committed to providing access to the transformative power of education regardless of socioeconomic status. As the nation strives to recover from COVID-19, higher education will be a critical component of rebuilding the economy. Your unprecedented level of commitment to education is needed now, as your decisions will directly influence students' ability to achieve their academic goals and support the viability of communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pierce. And now, Dr. White. Look forward to hearing from you.
Ranking Member Smucker. Oh, I need to. Can you hear me?
Good.
Okay, great. Chair Davis, Ranking Member Smucker, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for providing me the opportunity to address you today. For those who may be unfamiliar with the California State University, we are the nation's largest and most diverse four-year university system, 23 campuses, more than 480,000 students, and approximately 53,000 faculty and staff. 1 out of every 20 Americans with a college degree is a graduate of the California State University. More than half of our students are students of color, and 1 in 3 are the first in their family to attend college. 54% of our enrolled students, 230,000 of them, are Pell Grant recipients, and just last year alone, 63,000 of those Pell recipients earned their bachelor's degree. This dynamic diversity, together with our sheer size and the quality of our academic programs, makes us one of America's most powerful drivers of socioeconomic ascent. Our response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been guided by twin North Stars: safeguarding the health and well-being of our students, faculty, staff, and the communities we serve, and maintaining our students' progress to degree. In March, the CSU made the massive pivot to virtual instruction, transitioning over 70,000 classes, together with academic and student support services, to virtual modalities. We've taken great care to mitigate the pandemic's impacts to our students, especially our most vulnerable. Measures include maintaining on-campus housing and essential services for students who had nowhere else to call home, distributing thousands of laptops and tablets, and offering safe Wi-Fi hotspots to help address the digital divide, continuing to meet our students' basic needs with no-contact food distribution and emergency housing services for students who are food and housing insecure. Campus counseling services are offered virtually, serving students presenting with a variety of mental health issues during the crisis, and providing necessary flexibility around academic policies for current students and adjusting admission policies to mitigate hardships to prospective students and their families. We're extremely grateful for the more than $563 million in financial relief provided to our students and campuses through the CARES Act. Because Education Department guidance limited eligibility for CARES Act emergency grants, we have augmented those funds with campus resources so that all of our students in need due to COVID-19, including DACA students and international students, could receive much needed financial emergency support. Informed by the guidance of scientific and medical experts along with public health officials, we are planning for a primarily virtual fall with exceptions for critical in-person experiences that can be conducted within rigorous standards of health and safety. And as we plan for the fall and beyond, the CSU confronts a grim new fiscal reality. Our campuses face soaring costs and mounting revenue losses associated with the pandemic, putting our students' well-being and success at significant risk. The recently passed California budget cuts our appropriation by $299 million, 4.2% of our operating budget, unless additional federal relief funds are forthcoming. So I ask for additional support and investment during this historic public health crisis. I do so on behalf of the nation's largest and most diverse student body, keeping these students from all walks of life, enrolled and graduating with a high-quality degree, not only benefits them, their families, and communities, it is also a vital public good for the nation. Supporting higher education at this critical moment stimulates employment for hundreds of thousands of Americans now and into the future, spurring tax revenue while reducing reliance on social services. America, through the economic recovery and beyond, will require an increasingly nimble, educated workforce. We need culturally competent problem solvers, comfortable and capable in the sciences and technology, climate literate, and inspired to lead the world to a sustainable future. We need them to ensure a vigorous American economy in the changing world of work, and we need them for a vibrant and more equitable society. We stand ready to be a resource as you continue to explore ways to support higher education. Thank you again for the opportunity to address you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. White. And now I recognize Mr. Pulsifer for 5 minutes. Thank you for being with us, sir.
Chairwoman Davis, Ranking Member Smucker, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to share my views on the impact of COVID-19 on the future of higher education. At WGU, we are compelled by our belief in the inherent worth and ability of every individual and in the transformative power of education. We believe that the pathways to opportunity should be open to everyone. WGU is a private nonprofit, self-sustaining institution founded in 1997 by a bipartisan group of 19 governors who saw the opportunity to use technology and competency-based education to expand access to higher education and better align with workforce needs. Today, we serve over 120,000 full-time students in all 50 states, over 70% of whom would be classified in one or more underserved categories. We deliver affordable, relevant, high-quality programs combined with a student-centered instructional model entirely online, and that propels students towards completion, great jobs, and opportunity. Recent months have seen life upended for every American, and particularly for the nearly 20 million students enrolled in higher education. There are immediate and persistent challenges. Students have acute needs for material support to stay on their path to opportunity, and we need to ensure access to the online world in which learning now takes place. Over 21 million Americans, disproportionately people of color, do not have sufficient bandwidth to stream this hearing, take part in our civic life, access education, or participate in the digital workforce. There are also many anxious questions about the fall semester, but students also need us to look well beyond the fall and address strategic questions facing American higher education. Higher education entered the pandemic with pre-existing conditions: rapidly escalating costs, widening disconnect with workforce needs, crushing student debts, unacceptable racial disparities in outcomes, and low completion rates. Now, the sector is in the throes of technology-driven disruption irreversibly accelerated by COVID-19. Near-term issues are certainly pressing, whether safely reopening campuses, enabling institutions' online shift, or the protection of displaced students due to potential closures. We must reestablish the purpose and mission of post-secondary education and modernize the way we invest in it. We must embrace a technology-first approach to teaching and supporting students. We must move swiftly and radically to not only get the 20 million currently enrolled students back on their path to completion, but also upskill many of the 40+ million Americans who have been displaced during the pandemic and the tens of millions more whose work is being reshaped by technology. Said simply, we need to reimagine post-secondary education as a true lifelong model, providing high-quality, relevant pathways to both an individual's first and next opportunities. Even short-term support and accommodation should be designed and prioritized with the long-term in mind. The written testimony I submitted includes various policy ideas that I believe address many of the challenges our country and its students face as a result of COVID-accelerated shifts. These policy ideas are based on a few simple guiding principles. First, students should be prioritized over institutions. Second, student outcomes matter more than institutional inputs, and learning or mastery rather than time should be the critical denominator of education. In the 1930s, our nation responded to a great economic crisis by passing the New Deal. In the 1940s, facing an unprecedented need for education as young soldiers returned from war, hungry for opportunity, Congress opened the door to direct federal investment in higher education by passing the GI Bill. In the 1960s, facing widespread protests and social unrest in response to structural racism, we saw a wave of legislation around civil rights. Today, we find ourselves at the intersection of several similar great forces. We face a significant economic challenge, have an unprecedented need for education, investing in the future workforce, and sadly continue to grapple with inequities which have been both exposed and widened by the pandemic. We are living in unprecedented times that demand our best thinking, new frameworks, and smart investment. Congress can renew the pathway to opportunity for every American. We need landmark legislation on education and work, a new approach that can meet the challenges of this moment and the future that follows it, that is designed for the digital and information age, and that can fundamentally modernize our approach to investing in and unlocking the potential of every individual. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to be of assistance as you take on the critical question facing America's higher education system.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Now I recognize Dr. Harper for 5 minutes.
Thank you for including me in this important hearing. It is imperative that we devote serious attention to the numerous racial equity consequences of reopening campuses. I present 10 considerations in the written version of my testimony. I will talk only about 9 of them here, as the one pertaining to student visas and travel bans is outside the purview of this subcommittee. Here are 9 critical racial equity considerations. 1, disproportionately placing essential workers at risk. Custodians, food service professionals, and maintenance workers will inevitably be deemed essential workers when campuses reopen. Professionals of color are disproportionately performing these roles. Being required to come to campus and interact with other workers and students places employees of color and the family members with whom they live at greater risk of exposure to COVID-19. Campus reopening plans must consider the health implications of employees of color and lower income essential workers. Federal aid specifically earmarked for the safety of employees who are deemed essential workers would help institutions provide PPE, cleaning supplies, contact tracing, and testing. 2, the racialization of layoffs and terminations. Financial effects of the pandemic will force higher education leaders to make tough workforce reduction decisions. Inattention to the race of the persons being terminated and laid off will inevitably yield pronounced negative effects on employees of color, given the low-level service positions they disproportionately occupy. Hence, campus reopening plans must specify ways to avoid even more significant racialized employment inequities. Federal investments would help minimize the necessity of workforce reductions at higher education institutions. 3, risk of violence for Asian American and Asian international students and employees. Recent studies document horrifying acts of discrimination and physical violence toward Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in the US throughout the pandemic. Thus, reopening plans must include ways to protect these students and employees as they return to campuses. 4, trauma and grief support for persons disproportionately experiencing loss. COVID-19 deaths are disproportionately affecting communities of color. Because of this, students of color and employees of color from these groups are likelier than are their white counterparts to have lost a family member, friend, or someone in their community. Reopening plans must include ways to ensure these persons have more than adequate mental and emotional support resources. 5, sending infected students home to vulnerable families and communities. Many institutions plan to conclude on-campus living and learning by Thanksgiving in anticipation of a possible second wave of the coronavirus. Given the disproportionately higher numbers of COVID-19 infections and deaths among people of color, it is plausible that students of color returning home from college could pose an especially big risk to communities that have already been disproportionately devastated by COVID-19. 6, placing Black football and men's basketball players at disproportionately higher risk. In 2018, Black men were 2.4% of undergraduates enrolled at universities that make up the 5 most financially lucrative intercollegiate sports conferences. Yet, they comprised 55% of football teams and 56% of men's basketball teams on those campuses. Thus, participation in these 2 contact sports places Black undergraduate men at disproportionate risk of COVID-19 infection. 7, financial support for chronically underfunded minority-serving institutions. Investing significant federal COVID-19 recovery funds specifically into historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges, and community colleges would help them better serve the low-income Americans they disproportionately educate, most of whom are students of color. 8, addressing racialized digital access inequities. As we have seen throughout the pandemic, low-income students lack access to reliable, high-speed internet. Many of them are students of color. As institutions consider reopening in phases, with a fraction of courses meeting on campus and others online, plans must include strategies and investments in closing digital access gaps for students of color who continue to access courses from their homes in lower-income communities. And 9th, upskilling faculty members in teaching students of color online. Faculty development activities included in campus reopening plans cannot focus just on creative teaching tricks to keep all students online. They must also pay attention to ensuring that students of color are not experiencing the same racism in virtual classrooms that they experienced in on-campus learning environments long before the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harper. We appreciate all of you and appreciate your staying within the limits, especially. That's very helpful. Under Committee Rule 8A, we'll now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I'll be recognizing subcommittee members in seniority order. Again, in order to ensure that the members' 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time and will use a chime to signal when 1 minute is left and when time is up entirely. It's a little annoying chime that we have, but nevertheless, it's helpful to us. They will sound a short chime again when 1 minute is left, a longer chime when time is up. So please be attentive. If any member experiences technical difficulties during the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform. Make sure you are muted with the mute button highlighted in red, and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director, Sheila Havener, whose number has been provided. And as chairwoman, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And again, just putting this in a bit of context, as everyone has done, as evidenced by the last recession, we know that state higher education budgets are often the first to be cut during economic downturns as states look to balance their budgets. A study by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities estimates that states will lose $765 billion over the next 3 years. Already, states across the country have announced cuts to higher education spending. For example, California announced a $970 million cut for the University of California and California State University systems. These budgets drive up tuition costs that ultimately place the burden on students and their families and reduced academic quality. And of course, we know it's not just the tuition of costs that students bear, but it also is living expenses, a whole host of other needs to be successful in their studies. Dr. Harper, what was the impact of state higher education budget cuts on students and institutions in the Great Recession?
Thank you for that question. The impact was for sure disproportionate on chronically underfunded institutions like community colleges, historically Black colleges, and tribal colleges. Certainly the steep road to recovery for them was a much steeper climb than for more highly resourced institutions. In many instances, the financial pain of that time period still remains for many of those institutions as they are seeking to catch up. It is why I am especially worried about the financial consequences of the pandemic on those institutions. We have seen this before, again, with the Great Recession. So I'm hoping that Congress will pay particular attention in its investments to ensuring that those institutions don't have as steep a hill to climb in their recovery.
Thank you. And just following up on that, because I think sometimes people feel that there doesn't need to be a federal role here. So why is federal investment critical to supporting students and institutions? Why isn't it the state governments or in the case of other schools enough without that kind of federal funding? And what's likely to occur without that immediate federal action to address these funding shortfalls?
Well, for one, we will see tremendous unevenness across states in their investments in post-secondary education. But secondly, and I think most importantly, higher education is a public good that benefits the entirety of our nation and our nation's position in a global economy. Therefore, federal investment into higher education is really an investment into the economic security, the homeland security, and the viability of the United States.
Yeah, thank you. I want to turn to Dr. White. Dr. White, how will this multi-million-dollar state budget cut impact CSU's ability to operate and serve students? And I know you addressed this somewhat, but focusing on those students already having difficulty for a variety of reasons pre-COVID. We have to, I think, deconstruct the reasons why students were having those difficulties in the past as well. Dr. White?
Yeah, so in the spring term alone, across the California State University, we lost $337 million in lost revenue and added costs to pivot these classes and do it in a healthful way. The state budget that was just approved by our governor has a $299 million cut in our base appropriation, which is about 4.6% of our operating budget. Importantly, the federal government can play a role here. The way our budget is set up is that if you, by October 15th, provide another financial support to the states, that $299 million will be reversed and given back to the CSU. So it does have an effect. These numbers are real, and we will do our very best to meet the needs of our students, as many as we possibly can going forward.
Thank you, Dr. White. I think my time is up as well. Appreciate it. Now I want to turn to Mr. Smucker from Pennsylvania for the ranking member to ask his questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank all the panelists for being with us today. President Pulsifer, have just a question for you in regards to what's already been mentioned, college affordability, which is, of course, a top priority for policymakers, but certainly for students and their families. Now, I know Western Governors has a track record of keeping costs low, but this pandemic is adding additional financial burdens on all schools. I've certainly heard from institutions throughout my home state of Pennsylvania that COVID-19 is going to lead to increased costs on students in order to safely and adequately implement health protocols. So would you like to get your thoughts on that, including how has federal action helped the sector so far, and what role could Congress play, what role should we play in helping colleges open responsibly and helping them to reduce additional costs on students?
Thank you, Ranking Member Smucker. COVID-19 was surely not in any institution's strategic plan, and so the costs of adapting are definitely quite large and great for many institutions. Because of WGU's operating model, WGU itself is not experiencing any budgetary pressures like many of our peer institutions. That's primarily because much of our investments and operating expenses do not include operating buildings and campuses and many other things that also have then revenue sources from housing, feeding, or even student life activities and athletics, et cetera. So with that kind of operating model, where our entire self-sustaining operations is dependent on tuition alone, it has allowed us to it has allowed us to continue uninterrupted. I think these same COVID pressures are highlighting now, or exposing, if you will, the many challenges that exist with the economic model that we have in higher education in the U.S. And so, I think in general, we should be focused first and foremost with this principle on students, and how do we consider the funding and supports necessary to provide the instruction, the access, the improved digital experiences that they need to continue in their progress in their programs. And so how do we ensure that students are not so severely disrupted that their stopping out ends up to where they're not completing? And so I think that can be a guiding principle as Congress contemplates how to provide the appropriate aid and stimulus so that that the near-term impact of pandemic could be managed, but also we can design for the long term and really reinvent the economic model of higher education.
Thank you. I know the department and Congress have provided institutions some temporary reprieve from regulatory burdens throughout this crisis, which I believe we all believe was appropriate to help institutions quickly adapt to meeting the challenges of COVID-19. But what can we learn from that for the long term? What regulations, what guidance should Congress reevaluate for the long term in light of what we've learned through the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think those are appropriate. Surely the rapid shift from traditionally classroom or place-based instruction to a predominantly, or if not 100% online instructional model, it does require the rethinking of this faculty-student interaction. It requires rethinking about the even time of instruction and credit hour and the pacing of learning. And if you consider many of the eligibility requirements at a program and institution, even a student level for federal student aid, they're constructed around a very conventional model of learning. And so now when we are having a rapid shift to a technology-enabled model, those paradigms that we're used to are being reconstructed. And so I think it's appropriate to have short-term accommodation for that, but now it's really informing how we should think about distance education, how we should think about pace and learning progress, assessment of learning, et cetera, that those models are now should be contemplated in future.
What about current, and I'm sorry to cut you off, I'm almost at the end of my time, but we use a number of accountability metrics like cohort default rates, financial responsibility scores, and so on. Should we be looking at any of those and thinking about which of those we should continue and which should potentially be changed?
We should definitely be looking at primarily what I would call student success measures. I think there's elements around persistence and progress and completion rates, and also attainment and placement rates that lead to things like loan repayment rates as being a good measure of accountability for the effectiveness of the educational pathways. And I think that's a good example of where focusing on measures of outcomes as the quality measures of learning rather than institutional models or input.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I now want to turn to the ranking chair of the Education Committee. I understand that Dr. Fox, that you'd like to go next.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I was quite willing to wait till the next person, but thank you. I appreciate it. Mr. Pulse.
You're fine. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I actually was going to go to Mr. Courtney, but I just got a notice that you wanted to be next in the queue. But if Mr. Courtney is okay with it, we'll go ahead and hear from Dr. Fox, and then we'll go back to Dr. Courtney, to Mr. Courtney.
I'm fine. Go ahead, Virginia.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate it. Mr. Pulsifer, thank you again for your testimony today, for the work you do to help students, and particularly one student I know you've helped, and I'm very grateful for. Western Governors University has shown competency-based education, which is an educational program where students progress based on mastery of skills instead of time spent in the classroom, is a successful model for many students. CBE can benefit students by quickening time to a degree, lowering college costs, building portfolio of success. Could you describe WGU's experience building CBE programs and the success of your student graduates compared to other institutions of post-secondary education? I'm particularly interested in the achievement of your low-income first generation and minority students and how CBE benefited their lives. And again, I know of particularly one low-income first-generation student that you've been a big help to.
Thank you, Ranking Member Fox. Surely WGU was not the inventor of competency-based education, but we are one of the pioneers of it. We today have over 191,000 graduates since its founding. And the use of competency-based as a pedagogical model was purely a function of our focus on the student, particularly the working learners that we serve. And so it really, competency-based approach focuses on keeping the standards for proficiency or learning constant and allowing the time to vary. And that affords us the ability to better align learning outcomes with the workforce needs, to personalize the student journey to increase the probability of individual student success, and ultimately allows them to both leverage prior learning and move at their own pace. And for WGU, we are serving students in all 50 states. We have a 45% four-year graduation rate at the bachelor's level, which is significantly higher than the 36% nationally. We have really high employment rates at 95%, with 88% in field. And maybe more importantly, employers are 97% of them are saying our graduates meet and exceed expectations and are ready for the job. Particularly to your question about low income and underserved students, while we still see gaps in their attainment versus their white peers and their higher income peers, the reality is that they are achieving at a higher rate than we have seen nationally, and particularly in low income, rural, and military categories of individuals. And so we're quite proud of our ability to access and serve underserved individuals.
Thank you. The Higher Education Act does not have a clearly defined pathway for the CBE model. How is the flexibility of current law restrained other institutions from creating CBE programs? What recommendations do you have to reform the HEA to encourage the proliferation of high-quality CBE programs?
Thank you. Yeah, as noted in my written testimony, it's definitely, we believe it's time to fully embrace competency-based education. If I recall, according to CBEN, the Competency-Based Education Network, over 600 institutions have pilots or programs developing for competency-based education, but they are hampered, like we were, with the disparity with current regulatory definitions, meaning the design of it. And that could be trying to shoehorn program considerations into credit hour accreditation models, regulatory criteria around full-time and pacing, et cetera, that makes it quite difficult to rapidly innovate and expand access to these highly effective and aligned program models. And so we do believe that legislation and regulatory framework should encourage innovation, not just support it. And if we also focus more on student success and outcomes rather than prescribing a model, our nation and our American workforce will be better served.
Thank you. You've built a strong connection between WGU and employers. Why'd you make and how did this outreach contribute to your student success? What can other institutions do to engage employers in their academic programs?
Well, I think we simply believe that if education is to be the surest path to opportunity, then it has to be aligned with the market that presents those opportunities. And so we leverage large data sets from partners like MC or Burning Glass about workforce demands and roles, and that informs the programs and credentials that we develop and offer. And then beyond that, we partner directly with employers and experts from those fields to design the curriculum so the learning outcomes directly map to the competencies required in the workforce. We do believe that the future of education is based in skills and competencies, and it's a language that employers are speaking more fluently. And higher education can invest in this more workforce and employer partnership model to increase the alignment and relevancy of educational pathways to opportunity.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I'd like to submit for the record facts related to funding by various entities and the growth in spending that has occurred over the years. So we'll submit that separately. And thank you very much. I appreciate, and again, I appreciate Mr. Courtney's consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now turn to Mr. Courtney for his 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Davis and Ranking Member Smucker and Madam Mrs. Fox. Always glad to accommodate your schedule. Dr. Harper, you're correct in your testimony that our committee does not have direct jurisdiction over the State Department or the Department of Homeland Security. However, the Higher Education Act does authorize various programs that does promote exchange students and international cross-pollination in our higher education programs with countries all over the world. And, strictly from just a pure monetary standpoint, there's about 1 million international students that are enrolled in the U.S. That's about $41 billion in terms of revenue. The Department of Commerce actually treats that tuition money as an export for the purposes of our trade balance. And obviously, I think, as you, I'm sure, can attest, the policies of this administration, which has pretty much shut down the visa, availability for wanting to enroll in the U.S., and then just announcing that ICE is going to actually deport students from this country who are offering online programs. Just really kind of flies in the face what we're hearing today about the fact that we need a regulatory structure that needs to be flexible given the COVID emergency, and just to also recognize that online virtual learning, partly because of necessity, but also partly because of value, as we just heard from Mr. Pulsifer, is something that we are in a place right now where we have to incorporate having these arbitrary policies that are actually now talking about deporting people, really puts, I think, educators in a possible position, sort of having to balance things like, staying on the right side of the government and trying to protect their citizens. So I was wondering if you could touch on 10 points in your opening remarks and how we have to look at it in the whole picture holistically in terms of what we're facing right now for our.
Sure. Appreciate an opportunity to talk through that point. It's really important. Those policy actions are not only arbitrary, as you've noted, but they're also, I'm afraid, xenophobic and xenophobic. I wrote that particular consideration in my written testimony before we got the news on Monday about the ICE deportation. I somehow had a scary suspicion that this administration would find some way to target Chinese students and international students from other countries. It is so important to note that international students make our colleges and universities better. They afford American students the opportunity to interact with people who diverse points. So many are in their statements a commitment to preparing students for citizenship and a global democracy. Well, if that's the case, we need international students here, to afford our students, that kind of learning opportunity. But we also, I think it is important to, push against, all of the, xenophobic and xenophobic actions that we're seeing in this administration. And, these most recent actions concerning, ICE and the deportation of international students is just ridiculous. They require stronger federal oversight.
Thank you. I mean, we've had a lot of press in Connecticut about student athletes. I think the NCAA calculates there's about 20,000 international students as part of the NCAA. Gino Auriemma, the women's basketball Hall of Fame coach, was in the press talking about 3 student athletes that are in his program. One from Croatia, one from Poland, and one from Canada, who are now basically unable to get into the country. But to his credit, I mean, he pointed out in the press, and I'm quoting him now, not just athletes, but kids who are enrolled here going to school. What is the issue here? Can't we? What? Because they don't make $2 million in the NBA or Major League Baseball, the NHL, because obviously ICE has waived and allowed visas for athletes who are in college sports. So again, we're just sort of dealing with these contradictions that are again putting pressure on campuses to open more than it's safe, given where they're located. Well, create these different classes of people from overseas that can actually come here and enrich our country. So thank you for your testimony. And with that, I yield back, Susan.
Thank you very much. Mr. Guthrie of Kentucky, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you much, Madam Chair. I really appreciate you conducting this hearing. And my question's for Mr. Pulsifer. I know in your testimony, you said that suddenly 3.3 million teachers were suddenly grappling with how to teach online. And I know that Western Governor University is online, and you kind of master those competencies. And I actually had the experience of having my daughter home this semester, half a semester, and watching her online. And I'm not, although the price didn't change, the quality was the same between, and she was at her traditional on-campus program. So I guess my question, Mr. Pulsifer, is what has Western Governors done to propel students to the workforce that is at least equal to, I guess in your opinion, would be superior at least to traditional student program? I mean, what are the things online that you figured out that other universities need to do if we move forward this way? And specifically, like you address the minority students, or students of color, particularly with the digital divide that Mr. Harper out. And in Kentucky, I can deal with our K-12. The digital divide was also rural and urban as much as anything else. And so, but it's real people of color, more rural areas. So what areas, summing up my question, what areas would you have you guys heard that other universities need to look for online learning? And how do you address the digital divide?
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate that question. I think one of the most important things is simply embrace the entire capabilities of the medium. By that, what I really mean is, like, you have to have a tech-first mindset. How does technology enable all facets of the engagement of a student with the content, with the instructor, with peer students, everything else like that? And if you truly consider all the other dynamics that we as consumers experience, a few of them, if any, would you argue that the online experience is worse than the traditional place model, whether shopping, being, etc.? People learn those samples of that. We've had back because we realize that the teaching and learning model of online, it's about one-to-one interactions as it is about classroom. And so you have to think about how are you providing access to the subject matter experts and the instructors that really help at an individual basis. How do you change the native content consumption away from a lecture in a hall to what all the videos and the virtual courses that you can engage with, and you could also engage with peers on. So much of the instruction and learning actually occurs asynchronously. That's how the interaction with the instructor. I think there's other dynamic, by the way, that says you have to rethink the concept of time. That now an individual is in control of the time rather than institutions setting lecture schedule, hours for faculty, etc. The last thing I would point out is that the data that then becomes available to an institution to really test the efficacy of all the different pedagogical approaches, the technology that's deployed, etc., you can actually measure the impact on student progress and learning. This extends to our ability to help underserved students and individuals of color, because you can actually engage with them, every student, on a one-to-one basis. The last point is I would extend what Dr. White has also said in his testimony, is that WGU in like manner has invested in providing scholarships that cover specifically technology like laptops, as well as high-speed bandwidth access, things like that. We also directly invest in digital infrastructure to address this digital divide that now exists.
Okay. Well, also, so my guess is if you're looking at a model, online model, and you're on the other side of the digital divide, that you might not see that as an opportunity for you, even though, as you said, it could be an opportunity for you. So how does Governor's University reach out to students that may not view this as an opportunity for them to make sure they know that it's there?
Thank you.
I'm out of time.
I think you've had the second bell. So,
oh, I thought that was a spell. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I'll yield back in. I apologize.
Thank you very much. Mr. Harder of California, you have 5 minutes. Mr. Harder. Mr. Harder? Oh, Mr. Turcano? Okay, I don't have you.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. Turcano, you are next, but I hadn't had you earlier. So if you are ready to go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Davis, for convening this critical hearing on the future of higher education in our country. During recessions, states typically fund their public education systems first when they're experiencing, they cut funding to their public education systems first when they're experiencing budget shortfalls. And these cuts almost always disproportionately impact low-income students and students of color. Due to these cuts, institutions will be forced to provide less resources to help these students. The $4 billion Congress provided in the CARES Act was an essential lifeline, but it doesn't come close to covering the full extent of the need. The American Council on Education had previously estimated that institutions and students will need at least $46.6 billion to address the challenges and disruptions created by COVID-19. And as last week, ACE now estimates that institutions may need an additional $74 billion to cover just the costs of resuming in-person hybrid instruction in the fall. In my district, the University of California, Riverside has already experienced a revenue loss of $22 million. Now, my first question for Chancellor, it's good to see you again, sir. Can you please tell us about the revenue losses that the Cal system has suffered as a result of COVID-19? Dr. White? Chancellor White.
Just had to hit my unmute button. Nice to see you again. Yes. So just in the spring term alone, the sort of 2.5 months from March through the end, I guess 3 months, we had $337 million in a loss across the California State University. That includes the increased cost of mitigating COVID with personal protective gear, buying laptops and MiFis and giving them to students and to faculty and staff and all of that. That was just a 3-month period of time, so about $100 million a month. We anticipate that rate to continue this next 12 months. In addition to that, the state of California has cut our state appropriation by $299 million, which is 4.6% of our operation for next year. However, the federal government can play a role in reversing that. if there is another federal stimulus package that is received in California before October 15th, it's a reverse trigger proposal that the governor has signed, then that cut in our state appropriation would be reversed for the next fiscal year, which will be enormously helpful to meet, as you point out, the students that are first generation and often of low income who need a little extra support in order to stay engaged with their studies.
Thank you for that answer, Chancellor White. I see it's imperative for Congress to, for the Senate to act on, future legislation that would address, and I know that we do much of that in the HEROES Act. Dr. Pierce, what are the revenue losses at your institution?
Yes, thank you for that question. We're not a system, we're a standalone institution, so our numbers may sound small, but the impact is the same. We are looking at approximately $850,000 in just parking and auxiliary services alone. Our original FY21 budget was based on our enrollment being flat, meaning that we didn't anticipate growth nor loss. But we are now projecting a deficit of anywhere between 10 to 20% in enrollment. And that would essentially mean $4.2 million if we're down 10%, and $7.78 million if we experience the 20% loss. So that's a significant impact on our overall budget that we would have to mitigate in ways that would be very detrimental and painful for our students, faculty, and staff, and have an overall impact on our community.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Pearson. Dr. Harper, my question to you is, what lessons can we learn from the last recession about the impact that state budget cuts have on college access, affordability, and quality?
Sure. We can certainly learn from the last time that taking a largely raceless approach to correcting longstanding inequities is only going to, at best, sustain those inequities, but perhaps even exacerbate them. So I think, as I documented in the 10 points of my written testimony, we have to bring a race-forward, race-salient lens to thinking about COVID-19 recovery, because the truth is, we have way too much evidence to confirm that COVID-19 has had a racially disproportionate impact on communities of color. Therefore, it would be just really reckless of us to attempt to remedy those inequities in a largely raceless way. I am not suggesting that class and socioeconomic status is somehow unimportant, but there is a way that race and class commingle in these United States of America to, really produce disparate outcomes for people of color.
Thank you for that response. I see, Madam Chair, my time is up. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. And now we're going to turn to Mr. Grothman, but beforehand, Mr. Guthrie, if you want to reclaim your 1 minute, and I guess I should reclaim my 1 minute too, but Mr. Guthrie, go ahead, and if you need an extra minute, let's see, is Mr. Guthrie there? Perhaps Mr. Guthrie has left, so we'll go on to Mr. Grothman. If Mr. Guthrie comes back and later on, he can get his 1 minute again. Mr. Grothman.
Thank you. I always love these kind of online things because we can see the beautiful decorating that we have in our members' houses. So you do a very good job there. I appreciate looking what's behind you. I'm kind of in a boring conference room myself, but next time I'll try to give you more interesting decor as well. Mr. Pulsifer, is all of your classes online?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Do you feel, compared to a traditional college, a higher percentage of your graduates come out with a skills-based education?
Yes, we do. Based upon the surveys that we utilize from Gallup and Harris and others, is that there's a pretty good indication from the employers as well as the graduate surveys that our graduates are better prepared for the workforce. 97% of employers say that they are meet or exceed expectations. 97% of employers would hire them again. I think that our alignment in the curriculum with the competencies needed in the workforce is significantly increasing the readiness of graduates.
Can you give me a comparative number? Is there a comparative number you have for other universities?
Yeah, there is, at least in our surveys. If I flip to our annual report, I would look at things like, so in the Gallup or in Harris surveys, if we look at graduates, mentor, was it worth the cost? Our graduates are 77% versus nationally 38%. Did it prepare me for a job? 76% versus nationally, I think was below 50%. But from employer standpoint, there's data like 97% of graduates from WGU exceed or meet expectations. The other thing with Gallup survey is that, I think the numbers, I think we could provide them and submit them to testimony after the fact, but I think specific on Gallup, I think it's more than twice as likely that our WGU grads are performing well in all 5 dimensions of well-being versus nationally.
Wow. That's pretty incredible. Do you think it's because you're online, or you just think you approach your job with a different attitude, an attitude of a student-first attitude? Do you think you could duplicate these fantastic numbers in a more traditional university if they would adapt the same interaction with their students?
Based upon the research from Gallup and others, there are probably 3 things that I do think should be considered. And one is how do you really think about the faculty engagement with students and make it more personal in the interaction, if you will. The office hours and the one-to-one interaction become vitally important because a lecture is just content online. And I can
steer your people more towards a skills-based education.
We are entirely competency-based in our design, such that as soon as you demonstrate proficiency against the learning outcomes, you can progress. And so it's very clear that time now becomes a variable in most of our students' lives versus sitting in a seat for the prescribed 15 hours a week for 4 months. And so I think the mentoring, the faculty engagement model is highly important, and noted that if you have a faculty who encourages your dreams and aspirations, I believe Gallup noted that you're 2.5 times more likely to say that your school was right for you. I also think college affordability factors heavily into graduate satisfaction and performance. And then, of course, designing curriculum and learning outcomes that are directly relevant and ready a graduate for success in the workforce. That also dramatically increases graduate and student satisfaction. I think we have opportunities to advance education's design in all of these dimensions.
Okay, I'm particularly concerned with the middle class students. They don't get Pell Grants, so really in our society, we really put the middle class students at a disadvantage. How do you deal with student debt, or do you feel the amount of student debt your middle class students come out with is higher or lower compared to a traditional university?
We know for a fact it's actually lower. So 57% of our students at WGU actually utilize aid in some form or receive aid in some form for their education at WGU. And on average, our graduates are graduating. I'm just trying to find the specific statistics really quickly. They're graduating with just over $12,000 in debt at graduation. That compares to nationally at $29,000 per graduate. More importantly, you can see that our cohort default rates and loan repayment rates among our graduates are also performing better than national averages. Our cohort default rate is just about 4% versus nationally at 10.8%.
Wow. Well, I guess what it means is you ever think about setting up an Eastern Governors University?
The nice thing is that didn't preclude us from serving students in all 50 states. So we have more students in the East than we do in the West.
Okay, I guess you're giving me the hook.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I'd like to thank you again for letting us see your beautiful house. Very wonderful.
We're happy to hear next from Chairman Scott, Chairman of the Education and Labor Committee. Chairman Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and certainly thank you for holding this hearing. I'd like to start with Dr. White, and you've talked about this a little bit, but can you tell us exactly what would happen when if the cuts go through? I know we're dealing with this in Virginia. Our General Assembly passed a budget. When we came back for the scheduled, what we call veto session, where we consider governor's vetoes and amendments, we learned a new word, unallocated. The 2% teacher raise was unallocated. The counselors in the schools, the aid to low-income students in community colleges, construction at colleges, all unallocated because of the reforecast and revenues. We assume we'll learn another word if the HEROES Act were to pass and the revenue were restored by federal assistance, reallocated. Could you tell us what would happen if who gets laid off and what effect it would have on the on education if the cuts actually remained?
Yes, thank you, member. I think we've done several things to decrease our costs. We immediately put in a hiring freeze across the system. We've also banned travel, initially for health reasons and now for economic reasons. So when our various constituent groups gather, they're doing it virtually going forward. We also have, during the last 8 years, as I've been chancellor, we've been in a position to grow, and we've put aside a reserve during that time, as has the state of California. And so we're going to be using some of that reserve, spending that down in order to mitigate the costs. But there will also be some employee attrition issues that'll lower our cost as well. So we think, our enrollments are steady here in the summertime, and all indications are for the fall they'll remain steady. It's going to be variable across the campuses. Some of the urban ones are going up, some of the more rural ones are going down a little bit. But overall, the cut from the state budget of $299 million can be reversed if Congress acts with the next federal bill, and that will help us continue to make access to, and support of our students, generally of low income and middle income, to the last member's questions, as well as to our students of color. So we think it's very vital, a role for the federal government to play here, asking the state to maintain effort so the state doesn't further cut us. But if these federal dollars come in, it'll make a huge difference for our students going forward, earning their degrees.
Thank you. Dr. Harper, are you familiar with the new regulation from the Department of Education making it harder to get a recalculation of your financial aid if you lose your job or have other reasons to want your aid recalculated?
No, I haven't followed that legislation.
Okay, they're making it harder. So the problem there would be if you lose your job and are not able to make the anticipated contribution. Obviously, if you can't recalculate the aid that's needed, bad things will happen. But if you're not familiar with that, Dr. Pierce, you talked about reopening. There are a lot of things some things you didn't mention. How can you reopen without testing all of the students before day one?
Yes, well, with us being a non-residential campus, we would be following the guidelines provided by the CDC and the Minnesota State Health Department, which the state of Minnesota is providing testing for those who want it and need it, and we're able to work in concert with them. So our screening procedures follow the guidelines from the CDC, the Minnesota State Department of Health, and the Office on Higher Ed.
Does that include testing everyone before day one?
It does not.
What about ventilation?
Yes, well, part of our reopening is to look at air quality, because we are very much aware of the fact that it's something I recently learned, actually, is that we want to minimize any cross ventilation in terms of air moving from one geographic area to another. So we're looking at air quality, and we're also looking at space. So we're looking at our HVAC system and the quality of air in our HVAC system. And I've been actually learning quite a bit about it in terms of MERV standards, which are a way of measuring air quality versus air efficiency. And so as we're looking at...
My time has expired, but one of the things about air conditioning is that they recirculate the air, which has been identified as problematic. If they recirculate, if they pull the air out and then send it outside, and rather than recirculate, just cool the air the best they can, you're better off. But the ventilation has been identified as a problem. There are a lot of things about reopening that are problematic, and so you're dealing with it the best you can, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Now turn to Ms. Stefanik of New York for 5 minutes. Ms. Stefanik. And we'll go to Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to start with Mr. Pulsifer. Since many American families are above the federal Pell Grant income eligible level, how can aid better be distributed to students who really need help to return to school in the fall?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. I do think that there is no doubt a short-term hardship that should be contemplated in considering how to support students who need to continue on their path. And so even at WGU, while our institutional operational model has not been impacted, our students, given the disproportionate number that we serve in underserved categories, have been largely impacted by the economic fallout of the pandemic. And so there are considerations around supporting non-tuition related expenses, whether that be housing, food, other necessities of life, that we ourselves have established a $10 million aid fund, and in just the last 6 weeks have distributed aid to over 4,000 students. There are those things can be contemplated as we consider both short-term and long-term considerations that would not just only be related to Pell eligible students, but individuals who are trying to advance from lower middle income to upper middle income, and how do you support that investment? One of the longer term examples is something as simple as a lifetime learning account that can model after things like a health savings account, or even like a home equity line of credit that just allows individuals to tap into needed aid to support their upskilling and reskilling that will be increasingly part of their life going forward.
Very helpful. I want to turn my focus to a subject we haven't talked a great deal about yet today, and that's liability protections. All of your institutions belong to advocacy groups who have called for liability protections. And I want to go first to Dr. Pierce. Can you talk about how important are liability protections to reopen your institution for in the classroom training in the fall?
Thank you for that question. We are a state institution, so we are covered under the state of Minnesota. However, I am very much aware that institutions feel a great risk in terms of liability opening, in terms of how they are going to be able to cover any lawsuits that may emerge as a result of students, faculty, and staff returning to campus, who may come into contact with COVID-19, who may have increased hospital bills and things of that nature. Even though the schools are following every guideline provided by the CDC, their individual state health departments, and Office of Higher Education, the liability is there, the liability is real, and it has a chilling effect on our plans moving forward.
Dr. White, could you weigh in on that subject as well?
Our twin North Stars about moving to a primarily virtual fall term and quite frankly academic year was driven by the health and safety issues and our student progress to success. and health and safety issues, not only for our students, but for our faculty, our staff, and the community. You know, our campuses are in California, stretch over 800-mile distance from the North Coast up in Arcata down to San Diego State. And, you know, a lot of our students come from other parts of the state. So we're very concerned about those two things. We did not use liability as one of our determining factors to move to an essentially virtual fall and, quite frankly, academic year. You know, one of the issues here that I think is really important to recognize is this pandemic is not, a lot of people are using past tense. How did you manage the pandemic? This is not a 2-month problem or a 6-month problem. This is a, 12, 18, 24 month as a minimum problem. And we're in California, we're approaching it with that way. And so the flexibility around policies can't be short-sighted. Some of the recent policies that have come out that have undone some of that flexibility seem to be tone deaf to the reality of the biology of the disease. That is something that we're not yet able to get our hands around.
Mr. Pulsifer, your situation is different at WGU, but can you talk about how important liability protections would be for an institution like yours?
Yeah, Congressman, as you noted, obviously with no in-person instruction and no campuses on which students congregate, this is not a circumstance that we understand all the variables that play and considered, and so it is a topic that I would definitely defer to my colleagues that have campuses and are broader considerations there. I'm not unaware of them, but it's not something that I personally spent the time and attention in understanding the details to give a cogent answer to.
Understood. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. And I now yield to Ms. Jayapal. Is Ms. Jayapal with us? If not, Mr. Harder, you have 5 minutes. Mr. Harder of California. Mr. Levin of Michigan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. I'm here. Yes, appreciate it. And I appreciate you convening this hearing on this super important topic. You know, I want to get very concrete about the difficulties of running a university or a community college during this pandemic. And as a Michigander, I want to mention the COVID-19 outbreak in East Lansing that's been linked to a popular bar near one of our great institutions, Michigan State University. As of July 6th, yesterday, there had been 170 confirmed cases, 170 confirmed cases of COVID-19 linked to this one bar restaurant, including 27 secondary cases, meaning people who did not visit that establishment but caught the virus from someone else who did. The entire Lansing region has been moved back into the high-risk category of our Governor Gretchen Whitmer's reopening plan, given the enormous impact of this outbreak. This is over just an 8-day period following that restaurant's reopening, and it has since closed again. I bring this up because it's a cautionary tale of the risk involved in reopening college campuses this fall. We can't just think about classrooms and dorms. Colleges anchor entire communities, restaurants, bars, stores, and so on. Cases of COVID-19 within a student body or faculty aren't going to stay within a campus's walls. Many reopening plans developed by institutions center around the need to test students, test faculty, test staff to contain cases of COVID-19 on campuses. However, estimates show that the testing capacity in most states is still far below what is needed to contain the virus. And in fact, the lack of adequate testing is the lead story in today's New York Times. Dr. White, when you decided to remain online for this fall, and as you say, perhaps the whole academic year, did testing capacity and possible scenarios like the situation in East Lansing play into that decision at all?
Absolutely, it did, Congressman Levin. I mean, Jiminy Christmas, when you have, we're responsible for well over 530,000 people with our employees and with our students, let alone, to your point, exactly what's happening in East Lansing and the communities where we're embedded. We came up with a number of $50 million a month to do testing on a routine basis, which is just not in the cards. And quite frankly, to your point is, if you test today and you're negative and it's an accurate test, that doesn't mean you don't pick it up tomorrow, right? Right. So we have gone to the notion of really anywhere from about 3 or 4% to maybe 10% of our courses are going to be in person. They're the laboratories, they're the healthcare training where they work on mannequins, et cetera. But everything else will be done in the virtual space because of the cost and the inefficiency, really, of helping solve this and keeping the disease under control for our students. But we have like 25% of our employees are, in their 60s and above. We're responsible for them.
And you consulted with faculty and staff when you made your decision as well, I assume.
Faculty, staff, students, local public health officials, epidemiologists, and infectious disease experts in the state government. Yes, broad consultation across the system.
Well, as you say, it seems like you could easily see what's happening in East Lansing play out at any college ball in the country, or even at a party, on a campus anywhere. So let me ask Dr. Pierce, if we improved testing and stood up a nationwide contact tracing program, do you think school administrators like yourself around the whole country would feel better equipped to reopen, knowing there's an infrastructure in place to contain outbreaks? I'm talking about, Dr. Pierce, the federal government fully taking responsibility, saying we will have a national contact tracing and testing program in place. Would that affect your decision making?
I believe it would. I think that, we follow the guidelines provided for us by the state of Minnesota, the CDC, and the Office on Higher Ed, but having a robust screening and testing policy and practice in place would certainly play into our total decision making and make us feel a lot safer about welcoming our students to campus. Our whole guidelines are based on the health and safety and employees, and so anything that would enhance that would be welcome.
Thank you so much. As I hear, Madam Chairwoman, my time's expired. I'll just say that I feel so badly as a member of Congress, which is supposed to govern our whole country, that we're putting these wonderful administrators of our great universities and community college into this position of having to deal with this pandemic when we're not providing the national infrastructure of public health that we're capable of providing, that would help them so much. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Mr. Klein?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Virginia, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. As we're adjusting to this new normal, as they call it, I'm not partial to that term, but some are calling it that. It's important that we evaluate how this pandemic has impacted the traditional way higher education's been delivered to students and how it will continue to transform moving forward. Online learning is one of many approaches that's proven to be successful in its implementation, and exploring opportunities for expansion presents a promising alternative to in-person classes during this time of increased virtual connections. Not only does it allow students flexibility in their individual response to COVID, it solves many of the contributing disparities to educational access that minorities and those of lower socioeconomic classes face by eliminating certain barriers, but it does create new ones, as was already discussed in relation to lack of broadband access. Online learning offers more affordable options that can be customized to meet individual schedules, allowing for continued learning to be a viable option for those who are balancing other commitments like caring for family or holding a job. Prior to the pandemic, 20% of student loan borrowers were behind on their payments, and this further emphasizes the importance of affordable and flexible education, particularly as student debt has climbed over $1.5 trillion. When I served in the Virginia General Assembly before coming to Congress, I authored a bill inspired by the Western Governors University structure directed the Virginia Secretary of Education and the State Council of Higher Education to work with Virginia public colleges and any private colleges who were willing to develop a program for an online degree with a lower cost, at that point $4,000 per academic year. Virginia is blessed with many great institutions of higher education, and it's important that they're affordable and accessible to students. And I'm committed to continuing to work on ways to incentivize these types of innovative paths forward while I serve in Congress. So I'll ask President Pulsifer, I know you mentioned 77% of WGU alumni respondents reported that their education was worth the cost compared to the national average of 38%. That's a testament to the work you've put forward. Let's see, I want to ask, you know, as the COVID pandemic disrupted lives across the country, you know, you note in your testimony that many people need mid-career reskilling. What are some barriers stopping people from seeking additional skills-based education, and how can Congress help people whose lives were disrupted by the pandemic-caused economic downturn?
Thank you, Congressman Klein, for that question. I think there is increasing evidence for sure that that learning to earning, if you will, or educational work is absolutely the loop of what adults are going to go through in the future. And some of the barriers are simply that what is the program design and whether those programs are eligible for federal aid that many of our lower and middle skilled workers actually need to advance their careers and professions. And so for example, that many such programs, whether they're apprenticeship in design or short form in duration, whether they be technical coding boot camp models or short micro credentials, as they're often referred to, these often don't meet the eligibility requirements, whether it's full-time attendance or whether it's elements related to a degree seeking, a credential model that is a credit hour-based model. And so these aren't typically contemplated within the scope of federal regulation that governs higher education. Higher education generally is oriented towards the notion of a first-time full-time student who is pursuing an associate's or a degree of some sort. And what we're seeing is that employers are now increasingly entering into the space and providing employer-led training programs, paid internships, apprenticeships, or even partnering with technical colleges that are advancing the availability of these programs. Those are opportunities for us to address not only the first-time students, but also the reskilling, upskilling students.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Klein. And I now turn to Mr. Sablon, Northern Mariana Islands. Mr. Sablon, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank the witnesses all for their participation today. My questions are generally directed for Dr. Pierce and Dr. White, and then I have other questions I will submit for the record. And so the CARES Act provided over, $14 billion in emergency support to institutions and students to address the immediate impacts of the pandemic. Colleges are required to use at least half of the funds they receive on emergency financial grants that are made available to students, while the other half can be spent on institutional expenses associated with the change and delivery of education resulting from COVID-19. So distribution of other care funds from the administration to my districts, the Northern Marianas, were delayed. Direct student relief payments became the first injection of economic stimulus for individuals in the Marianas since the beginning of the pandemic. So I'd like to hear from Dr. Price and Dr. White, Pierce and Dr. White, about how they've used the federal funding that they've received to date. Could you both speak briefly to how you approach the awarding of emergency grants on your campuses? Specifically, I'd like to hear about how you identified and prioritized the students with the most need in awarding emergency aid. How have you used the institutional share of CARES funding that you received, and what other activities and services would you fund if you could access additional federal support like in the HEROES Act? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. What we considered the funding in terms of the intent from Congress to meet the needs of students, and especially students who had higher need levels. And we also had students' credit load, because that's part of the funding formula. So we identified eligible students, and they each received base award of $100. Then Pell eligible students received additional supplemental funds based on credits enrolled and a percent of the share. Then we also withheld a percentage of the total grant so we could award additional funding based on a short application to meet additional needs such as housing, food, basic needs, childcare, technology, transportation, and things of that nature. And so that's how we disperse the funds, because it was very important for us to use an equity lens in distributing the funds. We use additional funds. Sorry.
Okay. Well, go ahead, Dr. Pierce, please.
We've used additional funds to pay for increased costs. The funds that were in the second half of the funding that arose, such as cleaning supplies, laptop rentals for our students, access to library services and licenses and things of that nature, software licenses, internet access, additional computers, and nodes for students who did not have access to set up hotspots. And we anticipate spending a significant amount of the COVID funds for instructional costs increased because of the restrictions that we must operate under COVID.
Okay. Yeah, and this may be below Dr. White's pay grade, but could you have any comments, Dr. White? Do you have anything to add to what Dr. Pierce just said, please?
Well, we distributed $263 million in direct student funding directly to financial institutions. So our students, even those who lack documentation, could access the funds. It's our deep-seated commitment to inclusive excellence and equity, to student success. We wanted to make sure that students who were enrolled continue to make progress to degree, and administrative simplicity. So our awards ranged anywhere from $500 to up to over $5,000. And we used within the Pell student body, which is over 60% of our students, we used those with the least expected family contribution first and worked our way up from the bottom up until we ran out of money. Equity, ease, and simplicity and accountability were the ways in which we distributed those funds. And on the university side, just like Dr. Pierce, we're using it for COVID-19 induced additional expenses across our 23 institutions.
Yeah, and then Dr. White, you have a student population that's just as great as the district I represent in number. And I know I've been to your institution, your system. I have additional questions to ask, and I will submit it for the record. Please respond to them. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hate that bell.
Thank you, Mr. Savan. And now I believe Dr. Murphy of North Carolina. No, he was here earlier. See him. Let's see. Mr. Smucker, I'm going to go on to the rest of the Democrats that are there. Is there I just want to be sure that whether or not you have someone on your side.
Chairwoman Davis, Dr. Murphy does appear to be still available in the participant list.
Oh, okay, great. Dr. Murphy, are you there? Well, we'll come back to Dr. Murphy.
Madam Chair, Mr. Watkins was on previously as well. I don't know if he's still.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Murphy is visible. Dr. Murphy is visible.
Oh, terrific. Okay, I'm going to go back to the grid, but I didn't see him.
Dr. Murphy, you'll need to unmute, sir.
I consider myself unmuted.
Great. Dr. Murphy, you have 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you guys very much for your time. I want to actually ask different members of the committee to answer this question. I'm really concerned, and help me walk through this, because I think we've lost a little bit higher education, a little bit about what our purpose is in some ways. And I want to say that, a lot of industries and everything, obviously the nation's been hit with a calamity, the like of which we didn't expect this anymore. So, we want to train and educate our individuals that go off to colleges and universities to lead lives of constant learning. And that's what it is. It's not technical school per se. It's allowing critical minds to think. And I'm wondering, though, that in and of itself, though, where industry is exampled, we have times where we have to cut our belts and, trim our fat. And given the fact that money now flows very, very freely from the federal government to colleges and universities, really with no strings attached, I'm wondering what suggestions each of you could offer that colleges and universities could tighten their belt, areas that they could. Where heretofore it's been basically a blank check from the federal government, and now, given the shortage that's happening across every industry in the country, where colleges and universities will fall in that line. So if everybody can just do it in sequence, I look forward to your responses.
Sure, I'll weigh in on this one first. I want to acknowledge that so many college and university presidents, as well as campus reopening task forces, are working incredibly hard, and they are figuring out how to bring recovery plans to life, understanding that there are going to be really tight fiscal constraints. I wonder if instead that energy might be better placed on figuring out how to effectively educate students in a virtual environment, at least for this fall semester, and thinking about how to do that well. It feels to me like that is a much less expensive project in terms of both the expenditure of human and fiscal resources. I frankly find it annoying that so many campuses are scrambling to figure out how to play football this fall and how to ensure physical distancing in stadiums. It just feels to me like the money would be better spent trying to figure out how to close the digital equity access gaps, and again, how to better prepare faculty to teach online, at least for this fall semester.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harper, for your comments. I would like to just speak on the point of a community and technical college. In terms of that is exactly where we are spending our time, our effort, and our resources, and figuring out how to make sure that our students have the same quality level of an online experience, hybrid experience that they would have
last 2 weeks of August. So this could potentially unravel
delivering instruction. However, there are some career and technical programs that simply cannot be offered in an online environment. For example, aircraft maintenance technicians. External accrediting bodies and the work that they must do requires that they be face-to-face with their instructors so that they're able to demonstrate a level that is acceptable for the FAA. So it is incumbent upon us to spend the time and the resources to make sure that we're able to deliver that type of instruction to students in a safe environment that protects the faculty and staff who work in those programs. For example, dentists. That is another career and technical program that absolutely requires face-to-face interaction. So we're balancing the needs of our students, the needs of the programs, the needs of external accrediting bodies, so that we can meet our mission. Those are all incredibly important things for us to do. We are balancing the need to control spending by delaying maintenance or HEPA or different types of construction programs that need to be done.
Thank you. I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to answer. I appreciate the answer.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Congressman Murphy, Tim White here. An educated citizenry is the public good. Equity matters. So federal funds in Pell and for MSIs and for NPs institutions matter. Education really is a matter of social justice at all times, and particularly.
All right, but let me ask you this. I get all the matter stuff. How are you going to trim costs?
We have trimmed costs by decreasing hiring, decreasing travel, going together with other universities on procurement at better rates, and eliminating unnecessary activities that can be postponed in terms of construction and maintenance. But it's really important to recognize that the investment by the feds is a investment in the nation's future. Unemployment is 1/2 if you have a college degree versus not at any given rate of unemployment. So let's not be looking just at the cost, but looking at the return on investment.
I understand that. I understand that. I have a terminal degree, so I appreciate that. One other individual. Can we get our board?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Congressman Murphy. I think to get to the heart of your question, one of the considerations should be simply to consider what is the percent of an operating budget that's directly on instruction and advancing student outcomes and the attainment of their credentials. And then the question would be is like for those costs that are not related to instruction, what are the revenue sources for those? I would just echo what Dr. Harper had said, which is, the emphasis and the priority, I think, should really be focusing on how does an increasing percentage of operating budgets focus on teaching and the transfer of learning to the individuals who are seeking and acquiring a credential. There's no doubt that universities have taken on many different purposes and missions, if you will. Much of that is emerging adult experience, but that can be a very costly undertaking with a very different operating and economic model that now has been disrupted by COVID. And so I think one of the considerations is what percent of operating budgets are dedicated to instruction, and that is increasing probability of outcomes.
Thank you very much.
I guess that's our time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. I now move to Mr. Harder. Mr. Harder of California.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Madam Chairman. And
5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much to the panel for participating. In my district, schools are right now announcing their efforts to resume on-campus instruction. What exactly that's going to look like this fall. Clearly, it's going to be very different from what it might have been last year. And while our CSU, Stan State, will hold classes primarily online, I think it's really important to make sure that our educators and their families and the students themselves are getting guidance for reopening. I wrote a letter to Secretary DeVos with bipartisan support asking for guidance from the Department of Education, and I continue to hear from teachers and parents that this is their top concern, that we are, as we're going through this reopening process, that we're making sure that we're doing it safely with the right guidance to folks on the front lines. Dr. White, my first question is for you. Reopening is really going to be uncharted territory, whether schools choose to do so in the fall semester or if they choose to do so later on. What measures, what guidance and support would you hope to see from the Department of Education in advance of resuming on-campus classes?
Well, I think, the CDC has been helpful with their guidelines and the thing that I think really matters here is there's such variability across the state of California, let alone across the country with respect to disease progression. We cannot change the biology of the disease, but what we can do is change the human behavior around that biology. And here in California, and others have commented in other states in the union where things have started to re-escalate again. We imagine another bump later this summer. We have a forecast that's a very strong forecast of a greater wave of this disease coupled with influenza come October, November, and another wave coming in sort of March, April. So our planning horizon has been for the longer term rather than trying to figure out how we get through the next 2 weeks or 2 months. And I think that is a fundamental mindset. It took a while through collaboration with our faculty, staff, students, and communities to go from how do we preserve in person to how do we move to a virtual and then back away from that as the disease progression allows us to do. Fundamentally different approach.
That's helpful. And my next question actually comes from that. It's around connectivity. I think making sure that we have the right infrastructure in place is going to be really important. This pandemic has exposed the digital divide in rural areas such as my district. The president of Stan State shared with me that she's concerned by the lack of access to Wi-Fi and internet in the 21st century. Lack of internet access for our students is simply not acceptable. Dr. White, what can the CSU system do to help connect students in these areas to internet? And what can the federal government do to support you in those efforts?
Well, I think as a university, we've had a lot of our campuses create Wi-Fi spots in their parking lots, provide security services into the parking lot so students could drive, stay by themselves in their car and do their work. There is the EduRoam internet capability that perhaps a college student from Stan State could be close to an elementary school somewhere up in Sacramento or down in Fresno and still get access to the internet. The Governor's Council on Post-Secondary Education that Gavin Newsom appointed myself and the other heads of public and private higher education in the state has made getting rid of the broadband digital divide one of the top priorities for California. And this is a place where I think federal investment could help jumpstart that, if you will, to get more dollars into getting rid of this digital divide. That is really going to be the key for equity and social responsibility going forward, is to remove that divide.
Thank you. And that's a big focus for a lot of students in our area. Finally, Dr. Harper, I have a question for you. We know the Great Recession disproportionately impacted education in underserved communities with reduced enrollment, higher dropout rates, even students graduating with large debts and no jobs to pay back those student loans. What can we do to better support our students in this pandemic?
I think it is important for us to get ahead of the predicted outcomes and recognizing that in prior periods, everything that you just named had a disproportionate effect on people of color, and certainly lower income people of color. And response efforts, we will begin our recovery efforts.
All right, thank you. With that, I yield back. Thank you so much to our panel, and thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Harder. And I believe Mr. Watkins of Kansas is with us. Mr. Watkins, you have 5 minutes.
That's right. Thank you very much. And I thanks to the panel for offering your time and expertise. Mr. Pulsifer, what are the practical ways colleges can remain affordable for students? Has the pandemic changed that or created any new changes to making schools more affordable?
I do think the pandemic has accelerated a trend towards an increasing kind of digitally native approach to things. Digitally native means how do you really leverage technology in advancing the students' ability to access, afford, and experience education. There is no doubt that when you have a digitally native approach to things, that you're going to remove a lot of elements of an operating budget that aren't necessary to that. I think that's definitely been one of our core models, is that how do you focus the largest percent of your operating budget specifically on instruction? How do you make it more interactive with faculty? How do you provide more a higher student to faculty ratio? How do you make sure that the technology is accessible anytime, anywhere, so that students can learn independent of time and place? There are a lot of those elements that are addressing things that are not related to the acquisition of knowledge, skills, and abilities that they need in their credentials. And so you can take that out of the cost. Ultimately, we are at this point where I think we are fundamentally going to start addressing the arc of the cost curve in higher education and bending it down, rather than just finding out or devising new funding and financing mechanisms to afford an ever increasing cost. So those are opportunities that are now being accelerated because of this rapid shift to digital. And to Dr. Harper's point, I would simply add that the investment required to enable and expand the digital infrastructure necessary to cover 100% of our individuals in America would be far less than investing in campuses and buildings, et cetera, to try to make a campus available within 15 minutes of every person. Like, you can now bring education to every American. How do we invest in making sure that the cellular networks, the high-speed internet, fiber optic cables, whatever it may be, is fully accessible, and aid programs that cover technology, devices, et cetera, that are necessary for students to learn. And that hasn't typically been contemplated, but yet we're willing to afford accommodations for housing and living and other things like that that can be very expensive.
Understood. Thank you. And you did touch on this in your answer, but I'd like you to maybe think of any other mistakes institutions of higher learning are making with respect to their business models, and can those schools do better to adopt the changing landscape in the post-secondary instruction?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is to really, as an institution, ask yourself the question is, what is your primary purpose and how are you solving for that purpose, and let everything else become secondary to that. If your primary purpose is fundamentally about teaching individuals and helping them achieve the credential they came to achieve, then you're going to focus all of your faculty design, your cost and investment model, your pedagogical engagement, peer-to-peer interactions around learning. And when you do that, I think you can start to slough off a lot of investments that may remove that. Quite frankly, because we were designed in the age of the internet, we view place-based classrooms, campuses, constraints to access. We also view them as constraints to even advancing the quality of instruction and learning, because you can now personalize in a way learning in an online, digitally native environment that you can't necessarily do in a classroom of 30, 100, or even 500 students. And so I think it's just an opportunity for leaders and for individuals like yourselves and legislators and regulators to consider, how is technology shaping the future of how education?
All right, thank you, sir. And that's all I've got. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Watkins. We now turn to Mrs. Lee of Nevada. Mrs. Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank all the panelists for their insight today. I represent Southern Nevada, and we were hit, obviously, during the Great Recession, and now are impacted tremendously during this time. And what the Great Recession taught us, it was a lot that may be happening now in the higher education space and in our economy. Following that recession, many people sought out quick opportunities to gain skills and training in order to rejoin the workforce. This trend was also coupled with loosened accountability standards, which resulted in exponential growth of for-profit colleges. In Southern Nevada alone, we saw 30 for-profit schools close within the last 10 years. Data suggests we're seeing this pattern again now. And we know the track record of for-profit colleges and their predatory tactics of used to defraud students. In particular, Corinthian colleges and ITT Tech are a couple of institutions that abruptly closed their doors, leaving tens of thousands of students strapped with worthless degrees and mounds of debt. Unfortunately, Secretary DeVos's borrower defense rule has made it nearly impossible for them to seek relief for this burden, setting the precedent that fraudulent bad actor schools are coddled by the government while students and taxpayers are stuck footing the bill. I'd like to ask this question of Dr. Harper, and others are welcome to chime in. What do you think Congress can do right now to prevent predatory bad actor schools from preying on students during this recession?
I think that the Obama administration began to make some really serious traction on this, and obviously lots of those efforts have been rolled back. I think we need to restore those efforts. I think about this and I care very deeply about it, because we know that it is people of color, and more specifically low-income women of color, single mothers, working mothers, who are really the targets of the predatory practices. We owe it to those women of color to safeguard them from, being preyed upon when they are most vulnerable. As we see joblessness rates increase across the country, who's most affected? African Americans. So when those people are out of work and, thinking about, being out of work, affording them an opportunity to upskill, reskill, pursue higher education, we must protect them from being preyed upon by for-profit institutions.
I'll move on to Dr. Pierce. How does the department's failure to protect students from predatory actors hurt the ability of community colleges to serve these students?
It has a severe impact on our ability to serve the students. They arrive having used up a great deal of their Pell eligibility or having used up all of their Pell eligibility. They also frequently arrive already in debt because they've also taken on additional debt in addition to having used up their Pell eligibility. They arrive with credits or credentials that don't lead to a degree, that don't lead to a living wage, and it makes it very difficult to serve the students, and it limits what they're able to do. So they start 10 feet behind the start line, and it makes it more difficult for them to move forward to get to a place where they're able to actually complete a credential and earn a living wage. So instead of a program maybe taking 12 months, it takes 24 months. And they are steadily increasing their debt. Started out with a deficit to begin with.
Thank you. Just one final question. The pandemic has brought obviously great uncertainty, and we've seen many choosing to delay or forgo college altogether. And I'm concerned that some students may never return. I'm even more concerned about figuring out exactly who these students are. We know that FAFSA renewals among students of low-income families has dropped about 8% compared to the same time last year. Dr. Pierce and Dr. White, have your institutions seen a decline in enrollment, and can you expound upon what type of student you've seen a decline in?
At the California State University, we've not seen a decline in enrollment. But that's because of a massive effort by our faculty, staff, and administrators to reach out and recreate in the virtual space all the sort of things that students, first-time students as well as continuing students, expect from us. The summer bridge programs, getting their courses established, et cetera, et cetera. So that's our approach, and so far so good. We'll know in the fall how it works out, but that's kind of the direction we're headed.
Well, that's good news. Thank you. My time is up, and I
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Muser of Pennsylvania, you are there.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. To our witnesses, thank you very much for being with us and for your important information on this important topic. Over the last 30 years, public schools costs for tuition, room and board, total costs tripled after being adjusted for inflation, and private schools have doubled. Now, I certainly know the argument. I was on our state board of the public schools went up and cost more because in some states there were cutbacks in education funding from the states. But even if it's double after being adjusted for inflation, in the business world, costs largely due to technology and efficiencies were cut in many cases, or remained relatively neutral outside of course, payroll costs. So I just ask Mr. Pulsifer to start off with, seeing your background as a business person, you were in the technology field. You're now head of a school, of a college, an online college. What is? How do you explain that? The high level of increased costs over the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years to virtually all higher education universities and colleges.
Yeah. It's a much longer answer than time allows, but maybe let me just highlight two things that I think about. One is there is a investment or an asset and operating model, the utilization of which doesn't support the total consumption. And so that when you consider that for most classroom or campus-based, residence-based models of that, you really have to dramatically increase the utilization so that you can get the long-run average cost curve to decline. Otherwise, the support and operations for the buildings, for the facilities, for the student life, housing, et cetera, is like, that is going to ever increase in cost. And it's very difficult to not let enrollment grow with it, such that if you fix enrollment, you're not going to grow the revenue to cover that increasing cost. And there is a dynamic of that economic model. The other important thing to note is that over the last several decades, the percent of operating budgets that is spent on instruction has been declining over time. And the emerging expenses that are spent on student life or even research and athletics and other things, that has been growing as a percent of operating budgets. There's one other dynamic that I don't think is often talked about, which is this notion that quality is somehow measured by scarcity or exclusivity, such that in that model, you have this perverse behavior where if you actually increase price, the perception of quality goes up such that demand goes up. And so you have this weird model in higher education that there is no constraints, if you will, on institutions to raise their price and having no impact on demand. And so it can go on unbridled.
Yeah. Well, what's more of a concern is a student comes in, whether the university costs $25,000 a year or $60,000 a year, and what seems to be, and I don't get good answers on this in previous testimony, when they review their major, and how much guidance is received. You take their major into consideration. You take the level of loans that they're taking out. The students' feedback on whether or not they're on track to achieve that major in a 4-year period. Loans outstanding. So there's no big surprises at the end that they can't get a job for more than $38,000 a year, say, in many cases, and yet they have $60,000 in loans. Now, it doesn't seem to me, and I'm going to ask you all, is that type of feedback strong? Feel a responsibility to providing that feedback to the students?
Congressman Muser, this is Tim White. Our tuition and fees is $7,300 a year. More than half of our students graduate without debt. And those that do have debt is well below the national average. We're about $17,000 in debt. With analytics, we provide a lot of advice as students pursue their dreams, keeping them on track to degree. We've had a graduation initiative in place now for several years, and we're having all-time highs in any way you calculate graduation rates. Finally, in terms of bending the cost curve, it's just not the online colleges that can do that. During the last 8 years at the CSU, we raised tuition one time for $237 in 9 years. And we were serving, before COVID, we had returned to the post-recession budget, and yet we were serving 40,000 more students every year and graduating 35,000 more students every year than we did before. So there are ways of bending the cost curves and keeping costs down to the states, and but you have to be intentional about it, and we have been at now.
Thank you, and congratulations. Those are good stats. Appreciate it. Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Very much. Thank you, Mr. Muser. And Ms. Bonamici, you now have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. And thanks to the chair and ranking member and to all the witnesses. Just to follow up on the comment from my colleague and Chancellor White's response, the value that people contribute to our communities and to our societies, not necessarily measured in the amount of their salary, which is exactly why we have things like the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. But I want to start by saying that technology and online learning have a place, especially during a global pandemic. I would be very concerned if we're having a conversation about the trend of higher education moving to online learning. Portland State University here in Oregon just did a survey of their students. 70% responded that they had a challenge with the transition to remote learning. 82% had difficulties focusing on remote instruction and prefer face-to-face learning. Importantly, 50% said they don't have access to reliable internet service, and a third of the students with accessibility accommodations said they had very serious challenges with accommodation. So we know that there are a lot of inequities in higher education, even before the pandemic, and the pandemic has exacerbated exacerbated so many of those. I've spoken with college students pre-coronavirus about the challenges of housing, food insecurity, childcare for students who are parents. And now with most classes moving online or moved online and most campus housing and dining halls closed, students are really facing these sudden emergency expenses. And we know historically underrepresented students have been disproportionately affected, as Dr. Harper talked about. A recent Hope Center survey found a 19 percentage point gap in basic needs insecurity between Black students and their white peers. So Dr. Harper, can you talk more about the non-tuition expenses and how those contribute to gaps? And I really want to get in time for another question, but I'd like your input on that, please.
Sure, I'll be concise. It is really important to think about the important work that colleges like Compton College do to ensure that students have their transportation needs met, that they have access to food, and so on. And that we don't have a solution for that necessarily if we go too far online. I do think that Compton College really stepped up in, a really impressive way during the pandemic to, partner with Grubhub and with other entities to get meals to students and their families. But I'm not sure that that kind of model necessarily is scalable. What I think is more scalable is what Compton College was doing before the pandemic, where they were centralizing those resources. So we need more of that as we return to campuses at some point. We need a serious strategy to continue to meet students' basic needs.
I appreciate that. And I also very much appreciate, Dr. Harper, your statement that higher education is a public good. And I think certainly Chancellor White established that with his comments about what's happening in the California system. I was a state legislator during the Great Recession and know how hard it can be to balance the budget. But I'm also a graduate of a community college, public university, and a public law school, and recognize the value of these institutions and the detriment to students when education budgets are cut. So we did provide some funding in the Bipartisan Cares Act, but I know that's not enough, as Mr. Takano discussed. What specifically, and this is to Dr. Harper and Dr. Pierce and Chancellor White, if there's time, what specifically is needed to make sure that higher education institutions can continue to provide academic programming? And I want to emphasize that that is to all students and close those equity gaps that are so critical. And maybe we'll start with Dr. Pierce and see if there's time for Dr. Harper and Chancellor White.
Well, yes, we are really committed to making sure that students continue to have access to basic services. And so funding to help us meet those needs is critical. Students need transportation, they need childcare, they need access to affordable health care, they need access to mental health counseling, they need access to collegiate recovery programs. They need access to peer mentoring and tutoring, and they need access to their learning community. For some of our students, the act of coming on campus and being on campus is what inspires them to persevere. Being disconnected from the campus is very difficult for them. Everyone doesn't have a quiet, stable environment in which to learn at home. So we need to be able to maintain access on campus for specialty labs, computer labs, specialty software, career and technical programs where students have to perform skills that must be done on campus.
Thank you. And I see my time has expired, but I will ask Dr. Harper and Chancellor White to, on the record to respond to that question. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. And I don't believe, Mr. Smucker, can I just ask you, as far as you know, is there anybody on the line that I've looked through here? I don't see anybody waiting.
I think you're correct, Madam Chair. I think we're through all the Republicans.
Ms. Adams.
Okay, I will get to Ms. Adams. Absolutely. I just wanted to double check in with Mr. Smucker. Okay, great. Then our Dr. Adams. Adams is next, and followed by Mr. Norcross, if he's available and in the room. But or Dr. Adams, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the ranking member as well. Thank you for convening the hearing today. And to the witnesses, thank you for your extraordinary testimony. Historically, Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges, universities, minority serving institutions, and community colleges are primarily public institutions that serve many of our country's low-income students and students of color. However, these institutions are chronically underfunded. They have fewer resources to support their students. So Dr. Harper, how will state budgets cut disproportionately impact HBCUs, TCUs, MSIs, and community colleges, and their ability to operate effectively and continue to serve their students?
As a proud graduate of Albany State University, a public, historically Black university, I especially appreciate this question. State budget cuts will affect those institutions in the ways that state appropriations have affected them. They've been inequitable for far too long. And therefore, when there are cuts, those cuts are going to have, an especially deep effect on those chronically underfunded institutions. I really appreciated Chancellor White's earlier response to the question where he named the price of what it costs to be a student at the California State University. So many HBCUs, tribal colleges, and community colleges effectively educate students of color with far too few resources. It's quite remarkable, as a matter of fact, how they make so much out of so little. Just imagine if we were able to finance them appropriately. They could, in fact, together, they could help us close racial equity gaps across all industries if only we would invest in them equitably.
Absolutely. Well, certainly, thank you for your question. I am a proud two-time graduate of North Carolina A&T State University, the largest public HBCU in the country right now. And I'm a 40-year retired professor from Bennett College in Greensboro, which is a private school. But I've been reading that some of our nation's HBCUs could face enrollment drops of up to 20% in the fall due to the nature of this pandemic and the impact that it's going to have on low-income students. So, Dr. Harper, schools like HBCUs are heavily tuition-driven. These schools rely heavily on tuition for revenue. How should Congress support them at this time? And how do we prevent what we saw during the 2008 recession, where many of our schools, in particular HBCUs, faced enrollment drops and therefore fiscal calamity down the road? So is there a way to change that tuition-based model, in your opinion?
Sure. I think that federal investments that are specifically earmarked for bolstering enrollments at HBCUs would be incredibly helpful. Just 6 months ago, I concluded a project that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, in which I was looking at HBCU enrollments. The good news is that enrollments actually have not declined over time. They have flatlined. I think with some specific federal funding, that those institutions could, in fact, invest in the very expensive technologies that my university and others like it use to recruit students and to yield students. But, those institutions don't have the money. That when you have to make a choice between repairing a sidewalk to ensure that students are safe or investing in technologies that are going to allow you to, really bolster your enrollments and attract more students, most presidents are left with most presidents with the choice of having to repair the sidewalk.
Okay. Well, thank you for your question. I really want to get some input from the other panelists in terms of the importance of the meticulous Department of Education oversight over how CARES Act funds were dispersed and used by institutions. And you may have to send me this in writing, but I think we got like 1 more minute. So Dr. White or Dr. Pierce, if you could respond.
Yeah, we believe in inclusive excellence. All our students, whether they have documentation or not, whether they're international students, whether they're from Florida or from California. So we supplemented the CARES Act with our own money in order to make anybody who had a COVID-19 induced added expense was able to be supported. But it seemed incomprehensible to me that the Department of Education would exclude those students because they are part of the fabric of public higher education, bringing perspectives from around the world and around the country. All of our students.
Okay, well, I'm out of time. Thanks to all of our panelists for your responses and for your participation today. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. And I want to go back now to Mr. Norcross. Is Mr. Norcross available? And then Mr. Castro. Mr. Castro, you have 5 minutes. Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Yeah, thank you, Chairwoman. And thank you to the panelists for your testimony today.
Okay, folks, I am back.
I had a few questions about what you believe the long-term impacts of COVID-19 will be on higher education. And let me preface my question with this. When the pandemic broke, I had conversations with both superintendents in my district, K through 12 institutions, and also leaders of the higher education institutions, our two-year colleges, community colleges, and our four-year universities. And they all expressed some similar concerns and some different ones. But for example, many of the four-year universities said that they were seeing students drop off of plans to enroll in their institutions in favor of community colleges simply because of the fear that they wouldn't be able to afford to go to those four-year institutions any longer. We've seen that the pandemic, especially in certain states like mine in Texas, has stretched on longer and longer. And given that in higher education, there's often this inverse relationship between cost and completion. In other words, the places that are cheapest to go to often have the lowest completion rates. What is the long-term impact of COVID-19 on where students go to college, their ability to complete, and also the support that our colleges and universities are able to offer for them? And I open that up to any of the panelists.
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I'll just go ahead and offer a perspective on it. There's little doubt that individuals and their families are consumers of higher education and what we offer. When you have something like a pandemic create real disruption in the value proposition that was previously contemplated, that is going to change how the consumers of education think about it. And so simply being the father of two children who are currently in a traditional model of higher education, as well as a graduate of it, but also being the leader of a online competency-based education, I think the dynamic is such that if many of the really beneficial emerging adult experiences, social aspects, student engagement, if those things are not part of the value proposition because of long-standing or long-tenured effects of something like a pandemic, then the return on investment for the cost asked to be paid is going to be a challenge, such that many individuals, I do think, will start focusing more specifically on how can I still acquire the learning and credentials I need to advance towards the opportunities I require, and what is the more affordable ROI I can get for that if many of the other values that I previously had available to me are not available. The other thing I do anticipate is that you will see an emerging number of employers and alternative pathways that will start to emerging as you also consider the 40+ million adults and 10 million workers that are going to be displaced because of either technology pandemic that need to be reskilled and upskilled. And a four-year degree pathway is not going to be fast enough. And so you will see emerging credentials and alternative pathways that's serving not just the first-time full-time student, but the working learners and adults who need to find pathway to their next opportunity.
Oh, thank you. I don't know if any panelists have a
Congressman Castro?
I will be very quick and say that what you've described is exactly the mission of community and technical colleges, meeting the needs of students as they emerge. I anticipate over time you will see an increase in enrollment in community and technical colleges as people come back to seek short-term credentials, long-term credentials, transfer programs, as well as opportunities to skill up and transfer into different areas of growth. Community and technical colleges are affordable, they are a value proposition, and they offer excellent opportunities to retool our economy.
Thank you.
Congressman Castro, one thing is probably a conversation for a different day, but I think it's this learning deficit that is appearing in our K through 12 system with the interruptions and disruptions that are happening in public schools and in private schools that will lead to a disproportionate across the spectrum of race and ethnicity and income level. That those students, when they do finally get to a community college or a four-year university or an online college, will have a different set of preparation, and there'll be some learning deficits there that the colleges and the universities are going to have to deal with. We may not be causing the problem, but it's going to be ours to resolve at the end. That's going to fundamentally change, I think, the relationship of public higher education in particular in the years and decades ahead.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. And I yield back, Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And I believe that we've come to the end of members who are ready for questions. Gonna just check our grid again and be sure anybody came in that we didn't see. Okay, then I wanted to just remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing. So that would be by the close of business on July 21st of 2020. The material submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing, and only a member of the subcommittee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the hearing record. Documents are limited to 50 pages each. Documents longer than 50 pages will be incorporated into the record via an internet link that you must provide to the committee clerk within the required time frame, but please recognize that years from now, that link may no longer work. Pursuant to House Resolution 965 and the accompanying regulations, items for the record should be submitted electronically by emailing submissions to edandlabor.hearings@mail.house.gov, edandlabor.hearings@mail.house.gov. Member offices are encouraged to submit materials to the inbox before the hearing or during the hearing at the time the member makes the request. And the record will remain open for 14 days for committee practice for additional submissions after the hearing. And without objection, I would like to enter those following reports into the record. I want to thank our witnesses, certainly for their participation today. It's been outstanding. And we know that there are many more questions out there. We are all anxious and worried, quite honestly, about what's going to happen. And so we know that how important it is that your remarks have been today. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask the witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. And that hearing record will be open for 14 days in order to receive those responses. I want to remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, witness questions for the hearing record must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days, and the questions submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. I now want to recognize the distinguished ranking member for his closing statement. Mr. Smucker, thank you for being with us today, and would welcome your comments.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I agree this was a great discussion. I appreciate you scheduling this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses as well for all of your testimonies, for your insight, your perspectives, and for the great work that each of you are doing in your institutions. We've heard from all of you about the challenges that schools have faced in the spring as the coronavirus forced institutions to quickly shift to virtual learning environments. We also learned that there will be further obstacles that schools have to grapple with in the fall. The pandemic accelerated the underlying trends that are shaping post-secondary education. Increasingly, students are demanding a better return on investment. They're demanding on-demand education and the ability to fluidly transition between the classroom and the workforce. Simple fact is that the pandemic exposed what members on our side have been asking for some time, that Congress must really pass real HEA or higher ed authorization reform. We need to get beyond just doubling down on the failing status quo, which unfortunately is what the HEROES Act does. And Congress instead should come together in a bipartisan manner to pass, or we did come together, I should say, in a bipartisan manner to pass the CARES Act. We provided billions of dollars in relief to institutions and to students that have been impacted by the coronavirus. And unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are insisting on spending billions more in taxpayer money without first understanding the full effect and impact of the CARES Act. As Congress discusses additional relief, we should broaden the conversation beyond simply just more money for the sector. We should be judging our success by how well we enhance opportunities for students to seek education and to improve their station in life. Over several decades, the federal government has played an increasingly larger role in our higher education system, and with some pretty dismal results. Just over half our nation's college students are graduating within 6 years, and those who do graduate are finding themselves woefully unprepared for the workforce. So Congress must work together in a bipartisan manner to pass legislation that encourages universities to innovate and adapt to meet the needs of today's students. Our focus should be on reopening responsibly. We cannot lose sight of doing what is best for students. Congress can help all students, regardless of their background, succeed by encouraging proven methods of learning, such as competency-based education, improving workforce participation in the college classroom, and allowing for innovative and stackable credentials. The time for substantive HEA reform is now. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for your testimonies today. Look forward to working with my colleagues to reform the HEA in the best interests of students, institutions, and taxpayers. Madam Chairwoman, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Smucker. I now recognize myself for the purpose of making a closing statement, and I certainly want to thank once again our expert witnesses for joining the subcommittee's first virtual hearing and for your compelling testimony today. Our discussion certainly offered an important reminder that Congress still has much work to do, from providing institutions with additional relief to protecting vulnerable students from fraud and ensuring that all students can access and complete a college degree. You know, I think if we would love to have had students in the room as well to share for us how devastating for a number of students this has been. To try and make some adjustments, to anticipate, and to even inquire and ask themselves and their families, is it good to try and continue with my higher education at this time? What should I do for freshmen who are just entering? For those who have been, maybe they had a year of school behind them, and now they're really troubled about what the next step is. And I'm sure that you all could have offered some advice about that. But our role here is to try and understand, what can we do? What can the Congress do? What should we be doing? And so, again, we have a lot of work to do in that regard. We are well aware that there are a number of alternative pathways. And in fact, the Committee on Higher Ed has been working hard on workforce investment, looking at how we scale up apprenticeships more. How do we help young people who maybe are looking for alternatives to be able to access those, and especially at a time like this when things are so uncertain. But at the same time, we have to be sure that those institutions and those programs are highly accountable. Not just to the people that they serve, of course, but also to the taxpayers. And so that's a keen interest of ours, and we're working very hard on that. We also know that there are a lot of reasons why young people are not able to profit from their education as well as they should. And I think as we look at how we can reimagine, how we can think differently about higher education, that we need to be certain that we understand what are those reasons for them not being able to achieve in the way they wanted in the past, and how do we work hard, how do we adjust our higher education system to respond to that, and again, look at our workforce investments. So again, I thank you very much for being here, and we know that we must advance the HEROES Act. I think a little differently than my colleague, Mr. Smucker. I think that we need to have that support there in order to do what needs to be done to create this reimagining within our communities. If we don't have that, then those students who benefit from that support, that mentoring, all that we've been able to do in the past will not have that in school. And they will probably leave the system and maybe never return, even though they have the great potential to be able to have made those contributions as individuals in the future. We can't let that happen. So we have to be certain that we're thinking ahead about the support that's needed. And there's no question that COVID has impacted the ability of each and every school to prepare their students and to be able to deliver in the way that they need to deliver. So I hope that we can come together on behalf of the HEROES Act and overcome this pandemic and excel into the future. Thank you again. We really benefit from your expertise today. And with that, there's no further business. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you all.